Well, thanks, Lacey, and thanks, Jess. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so this is my book, Perpich, Minnesota Original. I had a chance to talk to a few of you out there, and I know there's a lot of Rudy stories in the room, so I want to leave plenty of time at the end to hear your stories. One of the things, one of the joys for me about writing this book and going around talking to people is there are so many Rudy stories. I think that's what makes him so special. And so I want to hear those stories. And I also would say that of all the places I do go around and talk to, none of them obviously are going to be as beautiful as Ely, Minnesota. So thanks for having me. My only regret today is that my kids are in school and my wife is volunteering at the Fergus Falls Public Library, so they weren't able to join me. Yeah, anytime you get a chance to go to Ely, that's a good day. In fact, one of our family's favorite memories is at the steakhouse, which I understand is no longer operating or is not currently operating, but yeah, we have some very fond memories of being here as a family. Yeah, my name is Ben Schierer. As Lacey mentioned, I am from Fergus Falls, Minnesota. My wife and I started a couple businesses in Fergus Falls. We have 5 kids. I served 2 terms as mayor of Fergus Falls. I'm currently running for state auditor. That's not why I'm here today, so don't worry, I'm not going to be campaigning. But I mention those things because it all does tie into why I wrote the book about Rudy Perpich. And so maybe I thought I'd start off with just read a little bit from the prologue from December 30th of 1976. I'll tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, tell you some of the takeaways that I have, and then I'd love to hear your stories and answer any questions you have. So here we go. From 1976, December. As I entered class that day, my father was unemployed, and I spoke no English, and yet today I have taken the oath of office as the 34th governor of Minnesota. This could not happen in many parts of the world. That's Rudy from his 1976 inauguration. In the early morning hours of Thursday, December 30th, 1976, Minnesota's newly sworn-in governor joined his small inaugural party at the St. Paul Hotel. He'd asked for no official festivities. This party included only close friends and family, relaxing and telling stories. They weren't political insiders from St. Paul. They were gas station owners, dental assistants, and the sons of union miners from Minnesota's remote and often neglected Iron Range. But tonight, they were in the private company of the governor. At the center of the attention, where he always was, sat the man everyone knew as Rudy, with his larger-than-life personality, his big smile, and his swollen right hand immersed in a bucket of ice. Rudy had been sworn in as Minnesota's 34th governor earlier that day, and he had publicly declared that he would stand until midnight to shake the hand of everyone who came to greet him. It was close to 1 a.m. before the line of well-wishers finally ended. Still, even after 12 hours of handshaking, Perpich was energized. He wanted to shake the hand of every person in Minnesota. The crowds had come to meet the man who'd been promoted to the top job from lieutenant governor after Governor Wendell Anderson resigned. They came from the Twin Cities and from small farming communities. They dressed in suits, working clothes, jeans, and formal wear. They stood in line for hours to wish Perpich well in his new position. As one observer said, they represented large business, small business, special interest groups, organizations, but mostly they just represented themselves. Perpich's day had begun with a polka mass at the Church of Assumption in St. Paul. Father Frank Perkovich, who'd won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Cleveland-Style Polka Hall of Fame, officiated the service. He referred to the new governor by his familiar name of Rudy, but also as the father of the family of Minnesota. Perkovich's band, the Polka Masters, consisted of an accordionist, a guitarist, a bass player, and a drummer. They provided Yugoslavian ballads and church music to a crowd that overflowed the 1,000-seat church. After the service, Perpich, along with his wife Lola, his daughter Mary Sue, his son Rudy Jr., and his parents Anton and Mary, was chauffeured to the inauguration, which was to take place at the state capitol at noon. Hibbing Judge Gail Murray, one of the few female jurists in the state, administered the oath. Her inaugural role was a harbinger of the intentions of a governor whose appointments of women to the courts would reshape the state's judiciary and who would appoint more women and minorities to official appointments, official positions than any governor in Minnesota history. The Capitol had the elbow room of a small town gymnasium as several thousand people packed the marble rotunda and crowded the balconies to witness Perpich's remarks. The Hibbing High School band fired up the crowd before and during the ceremony. Perpich wore a dark three-piece suit that he bought especially for the ceremony. As a student of gubernatorial history, Perpich joked with reporters that he was cautious about buying the suit. The last lieutenant governor to face similar circumstances in 1923 had purchased a new suit only to have the then governor change his mind about stepping down. But Perpich's focus on his clothing purchase was more than superstition. His reservations about his suit tied back to his childhood. So did much of what he said that day. And so did much of what would become one of the most consequential gubernatorial tenures in Minnesota history. I'll stop there. And maybe I'll pick up in a minute because there's a couple other stories in that prologue. I think that I started the book with that scene at his inauguration in 1976 because I think it tells a lot about Rudy Perpich. When Wendy Anderson was inaugurated in 1970 for the first time, the St. Paul Orchestra played. There was a black tie dinner. When Rudy was inaugurated, the Hibbing High School band played and they had coffee and cookies. I think that tells a lot about who he was. So here's my book. It's called Perpich, a Minnesota original. Forays, am I saying that? Forays, sorry. I always get that wrong. I always know I'm going to say that wrong, but they're out in the lobby selling books if anyone's interested. So thanks to them for being here. But Minnesota original, I wrote it with Lori Sturdivant. You guys familiar with Lori Sturdivant? I consider her the foremost historian in Minnesota, and she's a good friend of mine. And I met her through this process. Governor Mark Dayton wrote the foreword, and I will say that the foreword alone is worth the price of the book. I say that I have all the respect in the world for Governor Dayton, and his foreword is it tells an important story, and I'll leave it at that because they were close. In fact, I'll say this. In that line, when they were shaking hands, one of the people standing in line that night on December 30th, 1976 was Mark Dayton. And that's when he first met the governor. And later, he met the governor. He was working for Fritz Mondale out in Washington, D.C. And he came back and he met the governor that night. And the governor, Rudy Perpich, said, hey, come over to the residence. And Mark Dayton tells the story. A few nights later, he went over to the residence. And Rudy had this habit of he'd hold meetings, but he would invite one group of people, but then he would carry over one meeting to the next because he liked to get all the information he could from different groups, and he liked how the coalitions would work together, the different groups. And so Mark Dayton said he came to the first meeting and he just stayed, and he stayed pretty soon. It was after midnight, and the last meeting gets over. Rudy Perpich stands up, picks up the coffee, the cups, the plates off the table, goes into the kitchen in the governor's residence and starts washing the dishes. And Mark Dayton looked at him and said, well, if the governor's washing dishes, I better get in there with him, right? So the two of them sat there with their sleeves rolled up, washing dishes, talking about it will become a very close friendship. But that friendship did not last throughout the end of Rudy's life. And so I'll leave it at that. Mark does a great job of explaining that. But so I wrote the book. I'll tell you, I want to leave plenty of time, so I'm going to go through this because I know there's a lot of stories. But here's how the book came to be. Back in October of 2017, I was a relatively new mayor. I won election for the first time as mayor in 2016, and I got a call from Rita Albrecht. I don't know if anyone in the room knows Rita, but she was mayor of Bemidji at the time, and she said, "Hey Ben, come to Bemidji because there's a group of mayors from the Twin Cities who are coming up to Bemidji, and they want to talk to mayors from outstate, and they want to talk about the rural-urban divide." And there was no partisan affiliation. There was no policy talk. It was just simply building relationships, talking about what we can do as a state when we work together across that rural-urban divide. And a couple of things occurred to me at that meeting. First of all, the role that local officials play in that, right? Like how we can bring things down to the local level and we can get things done and we can bridge that divide by building relationships. But the second thing was that the history that Minnesota has of bridging that rural-urban divide. And the story of Minnesota is one of, I'm a big believer in Minnesota exceptionalism. And I'm a big believer in the history of this state of how we have gotten past those divides. If you think about the Minnesota Miracle in the early 1970s, that happened because there were voices from across the state and across parties that came together for the common good of Minnesota. You know, we were held up then. You remember Wendy Anderson was on the cover of Time magazine talking about the good life in Minnesota, right? I really believe firmly that we can get back there. And so I started researching the history of Minnesota and how we had overcome divides in our past. And so in the process, I wrote a cold email to Lori Sturdivant and said, hey, I'm the mayor of Fergus Falls and want to study some Minnesota history. And I wonder if you'd give me a few minutes of your time to talk. And within like 15 minutes, I got this return email and she said, I heard you speak at the League of Minnesota Cities Conference. And I said, that's a mayor I want to meet. And I thought, well, there you go. And we started a friendship that continued through this. But I had the good fortune of meeting people like Governor Mark Dayton and Arne Carlson, Joan Growe, Dave Durenberger, who I became close with during the process. A lot of people that had lived that experience I was talking about of Minnesota being exceptional, right? And Minnesota getting cross divides and Minnesota being the hero of its own story, right? And so I came up with this idea. I was going to write a book. And I said, Lori, I'm going to write a book. I'd like you to help me with it. And she said, sure. And so I wrote an outline and I said, you know, it had the story of the Minnesota Miracle and it had Joan Growe's story. It had all these different stories. It was the story of Minnesota in the last half of the 20th century about how we overcame divides. And I sent it off to the Minnesota Historical Society Press and they said, no, thanks. And I sent it to the University of Minnesota Press and they said, no, thanks. And, but I didn't give up. And Lori said to me, she said, you know, this is a really good story, but you're missing one. There's one story in there that you're missing. And that's the story of Rudy Perpich. I didn't even have Rudy Perpich in my outline. I have to admit, right? Rudy Perpich is me and Gary's hero. He's my political hero. And I didn't even have him in my outline for my original book there. But she said, you need to think about the story of Rudy Perpich. So anyway, I went to the Minnesota Historical Society and I was going through, and I'm an amateur historian, right? I'm a dad and a small business owner and a mayor. And I'm like, I'm going to write a book. So I go to the Minnesota Historical Society. You can imagine there's like thousands of boxes of papers, right? And I'm just like, what do I do now, right? But I just out of luck, I came across this. Anyone remember Tom Berg? He served in the legislature back in the 1970s. He's from the Twin Cities. And he wrote a book called Minnesota's Miracle. He wrote a book on the Minnesota Miracle that was published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. Anyway, I recognized the name. And I came across this packet, this 20 pages stapled together, and it was an oral history of Rudy Perpich by Tom Berg, or Tom Berg was the subject. And I grabbed it and I photocopied it and I took it home and I thought, and I started reading and I was like, wow, this is really good. Like this, whoever did this oral history was really good. And I found out it was a lady named Barbara Somner who was living in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time. So I tracked her down and she said, oh yeah, that's a project we did shortly after Rudy died. And I think there's a bunch more somewhere. And I thought, oh, okay. So next thing you know, I started calling around and I found 4 or 5 of them. Governor Mark Dayton was one of them. That's my wife. Tell her I'm busy right now, okay? It's all right. Perfectly fine. So anyway, I knew there was some more. So I started calling. And anyway, Gary's from Chisholm, right? Hibbing. So down at the Discovery Center in Chisholm, I called there and I talked to the archivist and he told me that first of all, he's really skeptical. Like, what are you calling about, right? What are you looking for? What are you digging around for? And so I think there's some more oral histories somewhere. Anyway, the long story short is there's 41 oral histories. All but 5 of them had never even been out of the basement of that library, from what I understood, right? And they were from people like Congressman Oberstar and Governor Dayton. There were people who knew Rudy growing up. There were people who served in his cabinet. There were some of his political rivals. It was Paul Wellstone was in there. Was these 41 people who knew Rudy. So it was all these stories that had been told before, but they were from a different perspective, right? And so it's this wealth of information. So I took that same, and I thought, there's all this new information. I took and worked an outline with Lori. I just said, Lori, what do you think about this? And she said, yeah, I like it. So we took it to the Minnesota Historical Society Press, and they agreed to publish it. And so now it's a book. It came out in April of 2025. Yeah, that's the year when, I guess, right? It came out this year. And proud moment, I got to say this. Probably, if you look on the back of the book, there's 4 blurbs. Governor Tim Walz, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senator Tina Smith, and then Kalia Yang, who, I don't know, she's Minnesota's Artist of the Year. She's a friend of mine. She also blurbed the book. So I say this: if they like it, you'll like it. Buy the book, okay? But so that's the so ultimately, you know, I think back to Lori saying, like, you got to tell the story of Rudy Perpich. And so I started to learn the story, and what I found out and why I decided to write the book was I'm just talking to a few of you beforehand. You know the story or part of it, but whatever part you know, it's an amazing story, right? It's a story of wins and losses. It's a story of comebacks, a story of the chopsticks factory in the Mall of America and the World Trade Center and the center of victims of torture, right? But ultimately, of all those things, it's a story of a kid who was born in a mining location north of Hibbing, grew up in a house that didn't have running water or indoor plumbing, who entered kindergarten not able to speak English, who rose to be what I argue is the most consequential governor the state's ever had. And it's a pretty remarkable story. I've had the opportunity, as I mentioned, he's now my political hero. I apologize, I didn't include him in my first draft of my outline, but he's the real deal, I'm here to tell you. But just a couple, like 5 or 6 things I wanted to just point out in the book, and then I'm happy to, then I want to turn it over to all of you and have a discussion about Rudy, because I know there's stories in the room. But, you know, it's a story of place. And I think that that's so important. Maybe I'll read one more paragraph, if you will, from the, just a short paragraph, but this is continuing on from where I left off. Perpich had been raised in poverty in the iron mining location of Carson Lake, Minnesota. In high school, he always arrived early to shower before classes, something he could not do at home. For school pictures, he was among the many male students who shared one tie. A few years later, he purchased his father's a necktie as a Father's Day gift. Anton Perpich scolded him for being so frivolous with money. When Rudy married, his father asked him to return a writing pen that had been his high school graduation gift so that a younger brother could use it. For Rudy, a new suit was a big deal, even as governor. So the story's about, you know, the story of Rudy is a story of place, right? And it's that upbringing from Carson Lake. Carson Lake and Hibbing was so important to Rudy, but as I talked to you earlier today, Rudy had a unique ability to connect other people's place. Like, he understood that your place was as important to you as his place was to him. I think that was really unique about Rudy, and I think it helped him bridge that rural-urban divide that I talked about. So he understood the value of place, and I remember, and when he loved nothing more than going to the coffee shops, right? Like, he didn't like parades, he didn't like political convention. He liked going to coffee shops and talking to normal people. And in Fergus Falls, we have the Viking Cafe as our local coffee shop. And, you know, sure enough, there's the people who've been there a long time. They tell the stories about when Rudy was in town, that's where he would go. And there's another story where, anyone remember the power line controversy back in the 70s? Rudy took that on right when he first became governor. And I think it's very telling how he handled that situation early on. It was actually Bob Berglund, remember, went to Washington, D.C. as a Secretary of Agriculture. There was a vacancy in the 7th Congressional District. There was a convention in Moorhead, Minnesota. Rudy was at the convention, and he snuck out of the convention, got in his car, ditched the media, his staff, and the state troopers that were his escorts, right? Ditched them all, got in his car by himself, drove to Lowry, Minnesota, population 300, went to the bar and said, I'm going to go to the Rutledge farm. And the bartender said, what do you, so he calls Dennis, the Rutledge farm, Dennis Rutledge. He says, hey, Dennis, there's some guy at the bar who wants directions to the Rutledge farm. And he says, who is it? He goes, I don't know. He's dressed in a suit and tie. Who? He says, he's the governor. So I don't know who that joker is, but send him out. Sure enough, 2 minutes later, Rudy Perpich was knocking on his door. And he sat at the farmhouse, and that just tells you about who Rudy Perpich was, right? Like he believed that he could go out and connect person to person. I think it went back to that place, right? He understood the value of place. And I'll just end this little section of place with Paul Wellstone. If some of you have had the honor to meet Paul Wellstone, and he was a wonderful politician and wonderful human being, and he's really, really, really good. He said there was nobody better than Rudy Perpich one-on-one. When Rudy would go into those coffee shops, and I think it was, yes, he was a politician, but it was also because he genuinely connected with people and their appreciation of place. So that's one thing that's really, really important to me. Oh, and then one other thing about place, I said I was going to end that, but the 1976 Bicentennial Commission, like Rudy understood that he could not become, he believed he could not become governor if he was not lieutenant governor first, right? So the political strategy. And he had a little riff with Governor Anderson because he didn't feel like he was getting the attention or he was getting the respect that he deserved. So Governor Anderson pushed off the Bicentennial in 1976 commission on Rudy, right? Ceremonial. Well, Rudy understood right away. I get to go to every town in this state, shake the mayor's hand, give them a flag, present them as a bicentennial city, and make them proud about the place that they are and meet them. And so, yeah, it's political, but it also meant something, I think, to him as a human being. He just really understood that connection place. Second thing, the second point is place, but the second thing is it's a story of comebacks and the underdog story. Rudy was always the underdog. He was a maverick. He had all these crazy ideas. A lot of them worked. A lot of people said they were crazy. At the Mall of America, they laughed at him. And now look at what, the economic engine that the Mall of America, when Rudy Perpich proposed Governor or Mikhail Gorbachev, Premier Gorbachev come to Minnesota, people laughed at him. Oh, here's great. Governor Goofy, here he goes again. Well, they weren't laughing when he showed up, right? Yeah, exactly. So it's a story of, the maverick, the underdog, the comebacks. I think that there's something that happened to Rudy when he was, I heard this from a number of people, but nobody really knew the full story and the whole story. When Rudy was very young, he had a sister, and his sister was killed in a tragic accident where she mistook scalding water on the stove for bath water, and she poured it on herself, and she was killed. She went to the hospital and ultimately was killed. So it was a tragic story, and it deeply, as you can imagine, it deeply affected Rudy's mother, Mary, and she was never probably the same. Of course, none of us would be. But Rudy saw something like he felt she couldn't move past that. So Rudy always thought, you can't look back, you have to look forward. So when you can't look back, you have to look forward. And I think that shaped who he was at the comeback, right? Like to always, like, don't let things get you down. So Rudy lost in 78. We could spend a whole hour talking about the 78 election, if you remember, but Rudy lost the governorship in 1978 and he was devastated, right? But what he didn't do is sit around and sulk. He went to the Bill Norris of data control and said, you know what, I'm going to be governor for the next 2 months and then I don't have a job. I need a job. I think I can bring something to your company. I want to be the economic envoy or the trade envoy to control data in Eastern Europe. I've got dual citizenship and whatever. He could speak Croatian. And so we went over there for the next 3 years. Rather than looking back, he was looking forward. And I argue in the book that that is probably the most pivotal point in his professional and his political career, is those 3 years he actually spent out of office. Because he came from the Iron Range, he was the son of a miner, he was really kind of anti-business, if you will. He had a lot of these really strong beliefs. Working for an international company, he saw, first of all, how business does work and how he could work with business. And he came back as someone that had a global vision of Minnesota. So when he came back and won and shocked everyone in that 82 election, which that chapter alone, I mean, that's a remarkable political story when he came back and beat Warren Spanish in 82. But it really sets the stage for what he believed from an international perspective was possible in Minnesota. And I'll say this, Minnesota was 49th in its spending for international trade at that time. The Minnesota Trade Office was 49th out of 50 states. Perpich, within 2 years, other states were coming to Minnesota to learn from what they did. He had a belief in Minnesota as a world-class place, which I'll jump right into that. He had this vision of, think about the Mall of America. Why couldn't we have it? It started out as Disneyland of the North, right? That's how that idea, it was actually Harold Stassen's idea that Rudy, everyone was laughing at Harold Stassen. Rudy was taking those ideas and he was going to make it into something. Gorbachev, the World Trade Center, he had these big ideas for what Minnesota could be. And I think, I don't know, I don't want to say we've lost that as a state, but I don't know that we've there was nobody who had the optimism and the energy that Rudy Perpich for what Minnesota could be, right? And I think we could use a little bit of that today, quite honestly. And there's a story of Sandra Gardebring, who Rudy appointed on the last day in office as Supreme Court Justice, state Supreme Court Justice, to make Minnesota the first state in the country with a majority of women on the Supreme Court, which is something he was very proud of. But Sandra Gardebring was also one of his first appointments back in early 1977 as the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency commissioner. She was very young at the time. But anyway, she told this story. She said, Rudy just had this, everything was world class. When Rudy would be driving around, it was world class. And they were driving around Minneapolis and there was this abandoned building. And then most people in the car riding with the governor saw an abandoned building. What did Rudy say? He goes, that could be a world-class bingo hall. And that's the optimism, the energy they had. So a couple other things, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time, but education. Obviously, Rudy Perpich was known for his work on education. 85, he had access to excellence and started out, Rudy saw education as his passport out of poverty, which was more than a slogan. I mean, that was the real deal. So he had 3 brothers, so there's 4 boys who grew up in this poverty that I told you about, right? And his mother actually wanted to be a teacher. And she was not able to be a teacher because her father died in a tragic mining accident. And she had to drop out of school in order to support the family. And that was a big, big thing, right? And so she vowed that her kids were going to get an education and get out of that life. So if nothing else, the remarkable story, here's these 4 boys from poverty in Carson Lake. They all 4 of them grew up to have doctorate degrees. And 3 of them were dentists. And then Joe, the youngest, was a psychiatrist and a medical doctor and a lawyer. So, I mean, the education that family, I think they really truly believed that education was their passport. And they saw that as a passport for other people as well, to a better life. And he firmly believed in education. And if you think about his 1985, he had access to excellence. It included, there was 3 big things that I talk about in the book. The first was post-secondary enrollment options. Some of you know, some of you kids, my son, but all 3 of I have 3 kids in college and 2 in high school. And all 3 of my kids in college started their college as sophomores because they were able to earn college credits in their high school, right? Which prepared them for college, but also think about the money that is saved, right? For a family. The second one was the art school. You remember the art school? That was Lola's project. And because it was Lola's project, that was the one that Rudy wasn't going to let go. And they saw how some of these similar art schools or different education opportunities in Europe really enhanced the quality of life in the communities that they visited when they lived there. So they brought that back. That was really special. I think that when I go around this talking about the book, that's something that really touches people, that art school. And then the last one was the open enrollment, right? Which was very controversial. In fact, the teachers union did not support Rudy because of that proposal, but he knew it was right. And so I think that's a really important point too. Rudy Perpich was, when he was convicted about something, he would fight the people in his own party. It's something we don't see enough of today. He believed in those education reforms. He was not going to back down, even though some of the supporters, even some of the strongest support was just, vehemently against it. He was not backing down. And I think we could all learn a lesson from that. Like to stand up when you know something's right, whether or not your party's on the same side that you are or not, stand up for what you know is right. I think we could learn from that. belief in government as a positive force. I think I'll just really touch quickly on this one, but I mentioned in the reading, he appointed more women and minorities to positions than any governor before. Marlene Johnson, who I became friends with during this process, you remember she was the first lieutenant governor. Rudy knew that, like I said, he couldn't be governor, being from Hibbing, being from the Iron Range. He wasn't going to be able to be governor without being lieutenant governor first. He believed at the same time that same with a woman at the time, right or wrong. He thought, we're gonna get a woman in this position to be lieutenant governor, who then can become governor. And that didn't work out that way. And Marlene still she's not, I won't say she's bitter about it, but there's an interesting story in there about the decision for him to run again in 1990 and not to turn it over to somebody else. But then there's, Rosalie Wall was the first female Supreme Court justice. He appointed her, and I mentioned Sandra Gardebring made the first female majority Supreme Court in the country. But this was not new in 1990 or 1978. When he was elected to the school board back in 1956, he was fighting for pay equity for females back then. Like, that's what he ran on then, and so it was something that he really believed in. So he believed that government could be a positive force in people's lives, and he had a commitment to promoting and lifting people up through government. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to turn it over and have a conversation, because I can go on and on, but I won't, I promise. He was able to do all these things because of a simple commitment. You remember the 1982 slogan? 3 words: jobs, 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 right? And that was something that he didn't shred the social safety net, right? He did all these other things, but he was able to do it because he was able to be elected. He was able to be elected because he had a deep connection to people and their connection to the value of hard work and the value of a job. And it was visceral to him. He would often tell the story when he was a kid, and he would come to the breakfast table. If his dad's lunch pail was on the table, it meant his dad was working, and he knew what that meant for his family. And if his dad's lunch pail was on the shelf, dad was out of work, and he knew what that meant for his family. So when he came back in 1982, he had a simple message. It was jobs, jobs, jobs. And Rudy would go anywhere in the country, anywhere in the state, anywhere in the world to get jobs for Minnesota, because he understood the value of work to working families. I think we've lost that. I think if there's one lesson that we can learn from Rudy Perpich, it's that we need to have a commitment to hard work, to the value. Work can bring so much more than simply a paycheck. I think it brings with it a dignity. I think it brings with it something that goes far beyond just the paycheck. And Rudy understood that. That's what was central his entire time from 82 forward, was all about creating jobs and opportunities. And it came from just a deep belief within him, and he was convicted on that. So with that, if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to read the